Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. I'm your podcast host, Matthew A.J. Anderson, a horror author, narratologist, word nerd, and part-time human. And today we'll be diving into a new series of books. In the last episode, I said that I didn't want to reveal what it was because I wanted to keep it a secret from you. But what I didn't know at the time was that it was also a secret from me. See, I planned on reading the Scareville books, a series by John Ward. And I'd read that book, and I then was doing some researching the author, only to realize that he was announcing that he was going to be writing an 8th book in the series, which disqualifies it for Chapter Spooks episodes because it needs to be a series that I own in full. I want to be able to complete an entire series for you, I don't want to go splitting it up. And so that was incredibly frustrating, especially because I read that book and I did not like it. So it means that when we finally do get around to that series, when it has 8 or more books that I own all of, I am going to be dreading that day because I did not like Scareville. But, okay, setting that aside, I then decided to read the only other book series I had with 7 books, which was Araminta Spook, of which I will say that is a fantastic series. If you've got kids who want to read an interesting, kooky little book, they can read that. The downside is, Araminta Spook is very funny. It's not really a horror series, and so that was disqualified. And so I was scrambling to get some book together, and I realized the best options I had were to put together a set of 3 books and a set of 4. And since I was trying to read Scareville, the other series that suits it perfectly is Frightville. Both series have the premise of a horror store that sells creepy things, each called somethingville. And both series also happen to be series that tricked me because I thought both were going to be referencing an actual town that was scary or frightening, but it was just a little store, sort of in the vein of Needful Things by Stephen King. So whilst all of these books in Frightville are self-contained, they do have a connecting element in the form of the store, and that's an interesting idea. I could have gone for a really good series, which is interesting why it's only 4 books long. And my theory as to why is actually based on the author himself, Mike Ford. Because when I did research, I realized that there wasn't more information out there that I already had, because I've already seen Mike Ford's name several times, because I've been purchasing several books in Chapter Spook series, and so I've seen his name a lot, at least 5 times in the Erie, Indiana series, which was an adaptation of a television show I saw a little bit of when I was a kid, when my parents got one of those trial Foxtel, when they used to do the trial period. And so I really enjoyed that show when I saw it, and so I really wanted to see what the book series was like. And he has written several of those books, I think at least 5, maybe even 7. And his name seems to be over a couple of other scary ideas. So my theory is that the reason why he wrote Frightville in the first place is because those series either didn't have him do those contracts, or maybe he had these ideas and he couldn't sell them, and so he thought, well, stuff it, these are cool ideas, I'll write them in my own series. And so he just had this basic premise of Frightville, of this creepy store where the things could come from, and then he wrote 4 books about that. That's my theory. I haven't actually done too much research into it, but it makes a lot of sense because these definitely have that same vibe of creepy, kooky things happening to young kids. And this guy is definitely a good author, because I have read these 4 books before, and whilst this isn't my favorite, he definitely does have some great talent, which you'll see later in the series. But the first book in Frightville, which we'll be talking about, and the first in the series, is called Don't Let the Doll In, which I think because I mentioned in my very first episode of Bone Chillers, because I have automatonophobia, I don't like statues, mannequins, and dolls. The idea of a creepy story about dolls, okay, I'm looking forward to it. That should be creepy. Of course, this one does take a weird, odd angle towards it, so I'm not fond of that, even though I do like some of the concepts around Frightville and how it has its proprietor, who has a bit of a character to himself that appears again and again. But, I'm talking around the book. I really should get into it so that you can see what there is to enjoy about this book. So let's just dive in to Frightville number 1, Don't Let the Doll In. So we start our story being introduced to the main character, Mara, and the first time we see her, she's running late for school because she's busy painting the windows on this gorgeous Victorian-style dollhouse that she's been working on for quite a long time. In fact, she's even got help from her mum and dad to develop this thing, to put all the pieces together. This is not store-bought. This is built from the ground up by her mum and her dad. So she grabs her stuff and runs to the door to join her dad and her younger brother, who is standing there a bit impatiently, but, he's basically 7 years old, so That's understandable. And then Mara heads to school, only to realize that because she was in such a hurry, she forgot some of her homework and stuff. I like it. It gets you an idea of her character and how much she is obsessed about this dollhouse. When she gets to school and to class, she goes in and she sees that everyone's hanging around a particular boy called Krish Dalwan. And in case I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, it's almost certainly an Indian name. So the reason everyone's hanging around is because he's playing with these really cool looking dolls. Action figures, dolls. They're the same thing, alright? Action figures are dolls. But the important thing is that they're these really creepy things. There's this weird fish monster that he talks about, and Mara goes over and looks at this thing he calls the werewolf bride, who has this crown that's covered in blood. And even though they're really creepy monsters and stuff, she's drawn to the fact that they are the perfect height for her dollhouse. And as soon as she sees them, obviously she doesn't want those dolls, but she's thinking, wow, I've never even thought about it before, but I don't have anyone to live in my awesome dollhouse. And so she asks him, where on earth did you get these from? And he said, oh yeah, the new store in town, Frightville. It is so cool. They've got basically all kinds of things, Maybe you could go get a creepy vampire to live in your house. And I really like that, especially because it's a store called Frightville. You wouldn't really go there for a doll, but I like how, because she's learning it from a friend and he's got something, she goes, something like that would be perfect. That actually leads her to go to Frightville. That makes a lot more sense than if she were to read it in the newspaper or something. But anyway, that's just me being bitter. So she decides to head there that afternoon. So when her dad comes to pick them up from school, she asks if she can go see Frightville. And he says, yeah, sure, I got a little bit of grocery shopping to do, so I'll drop you off and I'll come pick you up after. And because this is also our first introduction to the proprietor of Frightville, I'm going to read the excerpt from the book so that you can learn who he is in his own words. A few minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of Frightville. Mara and Jesse got out of the car. The grocery store is right across the street, their father said, pointing to it as if they hadn't been inside it a bunch of times. I'll be done in 20 minutes, don't go anywhere else, okay? Got it, Mara assured him. Can we at least take candy from strangers if we run into any? Only if it's chocolate, her father said, pretending to be serious. None of those licorice drops or gummy pumpkins, though. Mara laughed. Okay, Dad, she said. Jesse pulled her toward the store. See you in a little while. Chapter 2. Mara pushed open the door to the shop. A low, moaning wail filled the air. Welcome to Frightville, said a creaky voice. At first Mara thought the greeting was part of the recording, then a tall, thin man appeared from out of the shadows. He was wearing an old-fashioned black suit and a grey shirt with a black tie, and his silver hair was slicked back over his head. With his pale white skin, he looked like a character who had stepped out of a black and white movie. Allow me to introduce myself, he said. I am Odson Ends, the proprietor of this establishment. I'm Mara, said Mara, and this is Jesse. A pleasure to meet you both, said Mr. Ends, the corner of his mouth turning up in the barest hint of a smile. May I ask what brings you into my little shop today? My friend Krish was here yesterday, Mara answered. He bought some awesome figurines. Mr. Ends nodded. I remember, he said, from the Monster Town collection. Very popular. Are you looking to get some for yourself? I believe I still have Count Fangtooth and Lady Rappers, the singing mummy. Mara shook her head. They're not exactly what I'm looking for, she said. Mara doesn't play with monsters, Jessie announced. She likes dolls. I built a dollhouse, Mara explained, with my mother. Now I'm looking for someone to live in it, but I don't want any ordinary doll. I want something special, something nobody else has. I see, said Mr. Ends. You're in search of a unique tenant. He tapped his chin and looked at Mara with eyes that she realized now were the color of thunderstorms. I think I might have something you'll like. Jesse wandered off to look at something that had caught his attention, and Mara followed Mr. Ends as he walked through the store. Every item in my shop is unusual, of course, Mr. Ends said as they walked, but some are more unusual than others. I keep my extra special merchandise back here. He stopped in front of an antique cabinet with glass doors. Behind the glass was an array of objects, carved wooden animals, old metal keys, a clock with the face of a clown, wind-up toys, what looked like a small brass telescope. Mr. Ends drew a skeleton key from his pocket and slipped it into the lock on the cabinet doors. He turned it. There was a click, and then the door swung open. These objects are particularly unique, Mr. Ends said. Some people even believe they have a bit of magic in them. Magic? Said Mara. She laughed. Like they can grant wishes? Mr. Ends smiled. Who's to say? Why don't you take a look and see if you can find an inhabitant for your special house? There are several here that might be suitable. If you require any assistance, please ask. He walked away, leaving Mara to examine the contents of the cabinet. Her eyes scanned the shelves looking for dolls. She found one right away. It was a magician carved out of wood. His suit was black with gold buttons. He had a top hat on his head and a wand in his hand. He even had a painted-on mustache. He was neat, but he didn't look like he belonged in Mara's house. She set him back on the shelf. She looked some more, passing up a ballerina, a butcher wearing a stained apron and holding a cleaver, and a pair of twin boy dolls wearing matching blue shorts, red and white striped shirts, and sailor hats. And then she saw it. Tucked into a corner, almost hidden behind a ceramic dragon, was another doll. It was a girl, about 5 inches high. Mara picked her up. Her body was made out of snow-white porcelain. She was wearing a dark red velvet dress with tiny pearls sewn all around the collar. Her long black hair was tied back with a red ribbon, and when Mara ran her fingers over the hair, it felt real. Her face was painted on. She had brown eyes, pink cheeks, and a red mouth. Around her neck was a real gold chain with a tiny locket hanging from it. On her feet were tiny black slippers. Mara examined the doll more closely and saw that the dress had pockets. Something was sticking out of one of them. Mara picked at it and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a tiny piece of paper, the writing too small to read, and she could only make out the beginning. "My dear Charlotte," Mara read. She looked at the doll. "Is that your name? Charlotte?" And Mara is, of course, enamored with this doll. And I like it. There's even a cute moment how she says, "Do you want to come home with me?" Now, I've never owned a doll like that, but I have seen my little cousins play with dolls, and they definitely do talk to them like that, so I thought that was cute. So she goes to the front of the store, and she purchases the doll, and odds and ends happily packs it up in a little shoebox, which I like. Mara adds that it does look a little bit like he's putting her into a coffin, but right as he hands her the doll, he says, "Oh, and this is very important. When you take her home, when you put her to bed, you need to say this little rhyme." And the rhyme is, and I quote, "Stay asleep, don't walk around. Only in your bed be found. In the morning you can wake, but all night long stay tucked in safe." And Mara doesn't understand it at all. She says, "So, what for? What happens if I don't say the rhyme?" And odds and ends just says, "Don't worry about it. So long as you say it, everything will be fine." But Mara doesn't really pay much attention, and so by the time she's in the car, showing her new doll to her dad and showing it to her brother, she's basically forgotten the rhyme already. So, welcome to our inciting incident. So when Mara goes to bed that night, beforehand, she puts Charlotte in a little night dress and she sets her up in the bed. And I like this next scene because it shows not only the detail put into this house, but also helps in a later scene. So we learn that along with her mum and dad, she created tiny miniature books to put into the library in the bookshelf in the dollhouse. And she gives a little copy of Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce, a book on her own bookshelf, to the doll. And this is a real book, by the way. And when she mentions it to her mum's like, "Oh wow, I didn't even expect Hattie to be," and like Mara says, "Oh no, shh, no spoilers, because she hasn't read it yet." Come on, that's cute, right? So Mara goes to sleep that night, but she's suddenly awoken in the night when she hears a thunder crash. And the noise did startle her awake, but thankfully she's not really scared of thunderstorms. In fact, she thinks they're kind of cool, the fact that you see the flash of lightning and then you can wait to hear the rumble of thunder. But before she can tuck herself back into bed, Mara notices that she can't see Charlotte. She should be able to see Charlotte from where she's sitting because, first of all, not only is it an open-faced house so she can see where the bedroom is in the attic, but her mother and father put so much effort into this. It's actually wired up and all of the lights work, so she can see that she's not in bed. In fact, the covers are thrown over. So Mara gets out of bed to walk up close, and I like how, I don't know if it really counts as a cat scare because there's movement behind her and she turns just to see her cat, Gizmo. And if anything, she thinks that's kind because she says, "All right, Gizmo, did you move my doll?" But she can't see anything. And then she hears something moving in the hallway. She turns and sees something white flash by the door. And so she assumes, because she only saw it out the corner of her eye in the dark, but she assumes it's her little brother playing a trick. So she walks down the hall, marches in, throws his door open and says, "All right, gotcha!" But her brother's snoring in his bed, fast asleep, and he's 7 years old. He's not a very good actor. She can tell he's actually asleep. So she's confused, but she decides, okay, it must just be my imagination, I guess. So she goes back to bed. And the next morning, she wakes up and she sees her doll is perfectly fine in bed, so she assumes that it must have just been a really weird dream. And I gotta say, I like this so much because it's building tension. And as the reader, you can tell that that was the doll because she dressed it up in a little white nightdress. So when we hear that it's a flash of white running past the door, we know what it was. But the book's not hinting at that yet. It's too early. We need to build tension. So even our main character doesn't know. This is what is called dramatic tension, when the reader knows something that the main characters don't. So then we skip ahead. It's Friday night, and this is when Mara has her friend Olivia come over to sleep. And they usually start by making cookies together. They've made some delicious orange pistachio and chocolate chip cookies. And they're going to watch a movie. They're going to watch Unicorn Laser Force, Glittermane's Birthday Surprise. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But yeah, they basically enjoy the heck out of this movie. And then afterwards, they're talking about, because there's a minor plot in the movie about birthdays, so Olivia suggests that they throw a birthday party. It's neither of theirs birthday, but Olivia points out that Mara got her new doll, and it's kind of her birthday. It's the first time she's living in their house. So they both decide to throw a little birthday party for Charlotte the doll. And I have to admit, even I thought this next scene was cool because not only does it also play into the book later, but they basically make a tiny cake out of modeling clay and toothpicks that they paint white on the tips, and they make a tiny birthday present by wrapping a little box in some paper and string. So like it's really cute playing with these miniatures. I gotta admit, even as an adult man, I find miniatures adorable. The fact that people go to so much effort to make these teensy-weensy little things. And so obviously this is something that Mara's passionate about. She made an entire dollhouse after all. So they make this little cake in front of Charlotte with a little party hat they made for her, and they sing her happy birthday, and I like it. But then Olivia and Mara are talking about, well, what do you think Charlotte would wish for by blowing out her birthday candles? And Olivia suggests that maybe she'd want to be a real girl. And then they get into a conversation based on the fact that she does have really realistic hair. Like, it doesn't feel cheap and plasticky, it feels like real hair. And Olivia tells Mara that it reminds her of those stories of people who used to make dolls out of dead people. Like, they would cut off their hair, and they would even use some of their clothes from when they were alive, cut them up into little doll things, and then put them on the doll to use them to remember the person. And Mara thinks it's a bit creepy, but she says it makes sense. I mean, it's a good way to remember the person. And of course, Olivia then has to add that there's also the potential that they would become haunted by the ghost. And they're joking about it, and in fact, even Olivia is saying, well, you could make a ghost doll thing out of me. Here, you can snip off some of my red hair and use it to make a doll. But they're just joking around, and basically Jesse walks past the door saying, what are you two doing? And they say, oh, well, we're going to cut off some of your hair for the dolls. Snip, snip, snip. You know, just joking around. Like, I'm not going to lie, some of the interactions, especially with the kids, seem a little bit cutesy, but I do find it believable, especially that they joke around, and especially in the next scene, because Mara falls asleep, and then she wakes up because, this bit isn't realistic, but she wakes up because she can hear a tiny voice singing, happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, you know. You gotta add some of that creepy factor. But anyway, so Mara wakes up, and of course she goes straight to the dollhouse, and Charlotte's still in the house, but instead of her being moved, instead the other things are moved. She sees that there's a tiny pair of miniature scissors, which weren't there before, the presents have been opened, and most importantly, there is a dark lock of hair sitting on the table. And so instinctively she reaches for her hair, and she feels on the left side feels fine, but when she reaches to the right, there is a large chunk of her hair that's been cut off. So the next scene, smash cut to her yelling and accusing her little brother of cutting her hair, because he was there when they were talking and joking about cutting hair, and she thinks that he did it in the night. Because it obviously couldn't have been Olivia, because she's her good friend, and she didn't do it herself, and so she's yelling, and so the kids are yelling back and forth, and the parents, split them apart, and they talk to Mara separately, and they say, look, have you considered that maybe, because you and your friends were joking about this, maybe you did it in your sleep? And Mara doesn't believe that for a second, but honestly, it makes more sense than her little brother doing it, because they get along pretty well. He's young and he's silly, but he wouldn't do that to his sister. He knows how much she cares about her hair. So she ends up apologizing, and her mum says she'll try to see what she can do to fix her hair later in the morning, because they're arguing late at night. So they end up going back to bed, but the next day at breakfast, Mara is trying to ignore it. She doesn't want to be angry, she doesn't want to blame Jesse or anything, but I like it mentions that literally every time she adjusts her hair, she can feel that there's a chunk missing, and so it makes her angry all over again, and so it's on her mind for the rest of the day, even while she's running errands with her mum. When they get back from running errands, she asks her mum if she could use the computer, and she says it's fine, obviously they monitor their screen time, but she allows her to go on the computer, and she decides to look up this memorial death doll thing that Olivia was looking up, and she finds an article that's all about these death dolls. When it loaded, she started reading. The practice of making death dolls, sometimes called memorial dolls, is an ancient one, found in many cultures around the world. The dolls are made to resemble the deceased person and may incorporate the dead person's hair, bones, or teeth. Dolls may be dressed in clothing similar to what the person wore in life, and accessories representing their professions or interests may be fashioned for them. Of particular interest is the work of Violetta Grundy, 1878 to 1952, a doll maker who lived in the Allegheny Mountains of Appalachia. Grundy made numerous dolls for clients who sought her out for her ability to capture the likenesses of the dead in her creations. She worked primarily in cloth, wood, and sometimes ceramics, and her dolls were all inscribed with her initials somewhere on the body. And I like this because she then goes and looks over Charlotte's body and she sees VG carved into her back, so she knows that this is in fact a memorial doll. But little side tangent here, because I had to look this up. So I went online and I looked for death dolls, memorial dolls, funeral dolls, shrine dolls, that kind of a thing. And I found a lot of websites that talk about this. They talk about how there were life-sized wax effigies of dolls that had wigs made of human hair. They would dress them in their own clothing, and sometimes they would either leave them on top of the grave or they would take them home and put them into cots. And with all this research, I think it's pretty clear that this is fake. Right? A lot of the websites that talk about this use the same wording, and the exact same websites that talk about the dolls are also followed by a similar paragraph that talks about funeral kits, how girls used to have kits for running little funerals with their dolls because that was something you would play with, apparently. And I don't know whether either of those things ever happened, but I do not believe in any of this stuff, because first of all, you'd have to shave a child bald in order to make a lifelike effigy with a wig of their hair. So shaving a child bald to put them in the coffin just to put real hair on a doll that you then leave on top of the grave outside doesn't make any sense. Also, if these were real and they were cherished possessions of memorial for dead children, then we would have examples of them in the real world. They would have survived. At least one of them would have survived, especially if this was as common as this claims it was for richer families. So no, I don't believe that this is real. Which is kind of disappointing, because that kind of thing, the spiritualism back in the day was very common. Keeping locks of hair of people as memorials, even if they died, were very common. Also the whole idea of when someone died, taking a photograph to remember them. So having to set up the corpse in a chair and then take a photo of them where they'd look the most real because they could sit the most still. Like, all this stuff is real. I just don't like the fact that this adds in the whole website thing, implying that it's real. But I'm willing to cut Mike Ford some slack, because I wouldn't be surprised if he believes it to be true. And I have seen stories that play around with urban legends, you know, the alligators in the sewers thing, or the bogeyman. I just don't like the fact that by adding in the website, it sort of implies that this is real in and out of universe, you know? But okay, the next night, Mara and Jesse are being babysat because the parents are going off to see some show, some dance, I think. And so they watch a horror movie, and even though Jesse's watching it sort of engrossed, Mara decides that she finds it a bit too scary. So she says she wants to go off to bed early. So she goes to bed and she goes to sleep. But she then wakes up, and something's not quite right. She woke up when she heard the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall chiming. Its big voice boomed through the house, like a giant calling the hour. Bong, bong, bong. Although she was still half asleep, Mara found herself counting along with the clock. When it reached 12, she thought it must be done, but then it clanged one more time. 13, she thought. How funny, just like in the clock in Tom's Midnight Garden. She rolled over and stretched. Her hand touched something cool and metallic. She felt around again. It was the headboard of her bed. Only her headboard was made of wood, and this was metal. She sat up and reached for the lamp on her bedside table. But instead of a switch, her fingers touched a string. She pulled it, and the light came on. She was not in her own bed. She was in a brass bed, and when she looked down, she wasn't wearing her pajamas. She was wearing a white nightgown with red ribbon at the wrists and neck. She was in a different room than the one she'd gone to sleep in. She was in the attic of the dollhouse. It took a moment for this fact to sink in, because it was too weird to be true, but it was. The bed was the one in the attic bedroom, the quilt covering the bed was the one her father had made, and so was the nightgown she was wearing. She had painted the trim in the room herself. At first she thought she must be dreaming, but she felt very much awake. She touched the bedspread again, and the bedside table. They were real too. She got out of bed and stepped onto the wood boards of the floor. They were cool beneath her bare feet. She walked around looking at everything. There was the dresser, the braided rug, the mirror, all the miniature things she had put into the bedroom in the dollhouse. only now they were all life-sized. Moonlight was coming in through the large window at the end of the room. Mara walked over to it and looked out. But instead of seeing trees or lawn or anything she might expect to see out the window of a house, she saw her own bedroom. What she had thought was moonlight was the glow of the lamp on her bedside table. Before she could even begin to comprehend what was happening, something blocked out the light. Suddenly, a huge brown eye appeared in the window. It stared at her, unblinking, as she stared back, her heart thumping in her chest. She stepped away from the window, horrified. The eye retreated, and Mara rushed to the glass. Outside, a face came into view. She saw pale skin, rosy cheeks, a red mouth. Now 2 eyes stared back at her, both open wide. It was Charlotte. The doll stood in Mara's room. Charlotte was wearing her red dress and looked exactly as she always did, only she was enormous, a giant who towered over the house as she looked at it with eyes that never blinked. But it's not just that Charlotte's big, Mara realized. I'm small. Charlotte turned away from the house and walked stiffly out of Mara's bedroom. Where was she going? Mara thought about Jesse, who was probably asleep in his own room. Were their parents home yet? Or was Carolina still there? Then Mara remembered the clock striking 13. That was impossible, of course, and yet she had counted the chimes. She turned and ran down the dollhouse staircase from the attic to the second floor. Bedrooms here, all of them empty except for the furniture Mara had put into them. She ran down another flight and found herself in the front hall of the house. There was the grandfather clock she had heard. She had helped her mother put it together from a kit, but that one had been fake. This one was real. The hands were slowly circling the dial, but they were going backward. Mara ran into the dining room where she found the table covered with presents. The party hat that Charlotte had been wearing was there. Next to it lay a doll. A doll with brown hair and smooth brown skin. A doll that looked a lot like Mara. She picked it up. It had been made out of some of the clay from which she and Olivia had fashioned the birthday cake, and on its head was real hair. Her hair. Mara dropped the doll in horror and spun around. It was then that she realized that where there should have been no wall, there now was one. She should have been able to look out into her room. Instead, she was staring at a wall. The dollhouse had somehow transformed into an actual house, and she was trapped inside it. Okay, a creepy scene, but I'm not gonna lie, I really don't like the way the magic seems to work in this story, but I'll probably talk about that more at the end. What matters is that a girl is now stuck in this house, really tiny. So she goes wandering around looking for something that she can use, but besides the lights turning on and the grandfather clock, everything else in the house is still made of, just carved wood and plastic. It's not real. There's no food in the pantries or the fridge. There's nothing she can use to escape. I mean, I would argue that she doesn't even try to break one of the windows, but okay, fair enough, because it seems to imply that this dollhouse is sitting on a table, so maybe if she broke through the window, she'd just fall to the ground, which from her perspective would be several stories high. So whatever, that doesn't matter. What matters is that she keeps looking around, she looks through the books that are on the ground, and she finds that letter that she first saw in Charlotte's pocket. And I like that she says that she looks at this letter, and now that she's tiny, she can actually read the letter. And so I'll read it for you now. This is from the book. It says, "My dear Charlotte, I do not know why you were taken from me so soon. My heart is broken at the loss of you. But there is still hope. I will fashion a doll, the most beautiful doll I have yet made. I will make for it a dress like the one you longed for in life, scarlet like the fever that claimed you. I will give it your hair. I know that someday we will be reunited in the hereafter. Until then, you will live with me in this form. Your loving mother, Violetta Grundy." Okay, so now we know who we're dealing with here. This is Charlotte Grundy, Violetta Grundy's daughter. Okay, that's starting to make a lot of sense. I like that. That's kind of fun. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help Mara to escape from the dollhouse. So she's thinking, and she remembers that odds and ends had that rhyme he said that she needs to say. So she's trying to remember this rhyme, but she could barely remember. It's like something about safe at night, stay in bed, something like that. But as she's thinking about it, she hears that grandfather clock start chiming again. And after it clangs several times, suddenly dark shapes come rushing at her, and she closes her eyes and screams. And then suddenly it stops, and she opens her eyes, and she's in her bedroom. Just as her father comes running in to see why she's screaming, saying, "What's wrong?" And all she can say is that it must have been a bad dream. And so her father ends leaving. She goes back to bed because she now knows her plan of attack. Tomorrow morning, she has to go back to Frightville. Now, I like this little scene because she goes back to the store and odds and ends isn't there, but as she's looking at the closed sign and she's a little bit, crestfallen, like, oh, I don't know what to do, she meets two twin sisters. They're called Persimmon and Pawpaw, the Porridge sisters. And they're both very odd, But what matters is that they mentioned that the reason they're there is because Odds and Ends left to go off and get some more product for his store, and so they're taking care of the store for him because they needed to use his back room. Like, one of the sisters is like, oh, we're using it for a magic, and then her sister nudges her in the ribs, and she says, we're just using his back room for our own projects while he's gone. So they talk to our girl Mara, and when she tells them that she was taking care of a doll, and they mention, oh, was it Charlotte, and they both look a little bit worried, she explains that she didn't say the rhyme, and the sisters are very worried about that, and they then say, well, there's only one thing for it. You're going to have to talk to Charlotte and convince her to move on to the hereafter. And Mara says, oh, okay, so that should be easy then, right? She wants to see her mother. But they insist, well, you don't understand. See, she's a ghost now. She's not really a human. She will want to be a human. That's why she's clinging onto this life. She wants to be alive. And so you're going to have to make sure that she accepts that she must move on and join her mother. And so she says, well, how do I do that? She's enormous. And the sisters, they decide, well, the best thing is to stop the grandfather clock. Stop it from turning. But make sure you don't break it, because if you break it, you might be stuck there forever. So, okay, we now have our plan of attack. And like I said, there's no need to add in these quirky sisters, but I like it. It adds a little bit more world building to this Odds and Ends character. He means that he's at least a little bit more interesting than just the guy in the dark suit with the grey shirt, you know? Now, it started raining as they were talking, and so it is really storming down by the time Mara heads home, and she is completely drenched. And so when her mum sees her, she is really annoyed with her, worried that she'd get a cold, and Mara is annoyed that they're fussing, but then she gets an idea. She fakes a sneeze and says, you know what, I think you might be right, maybe I got a cold. And so they send her straight to bed. And so she's lying in bed, and she's, getting soup and getting doted on, but she's worried about finally going to sleep, especially when her mum offers her some cough medicine to help her feel better. But it's that stuff you take that's drowsy cough medicine, and so she's a bit worried that she's going to have to go to sleep even quicker than she thought. But just before she takes the medicine, drinks all the soup and all the stuff, she asks her mum, how do you stop a grandfather clock? And I like how this ties back, because her mum doesn't know why on earth she'd want to know that. And so Mara says, well, I was thinking about that book, Tom's Midnight Garden, right? It happens because the clock strikes 13, so what would happen if he stopped the clock? I like that, it sort of works. And so her mum explains, well, they tend to use a weight that pulls down and makes the clock gears keep spinning, so I guess if you stop the weight from pulling down, then you would stop the clock. So then, Mara does the soup and has the syrup and all that stuff. She lies in bed, and soon enough she finds herself falling asleep, and she can hear the chimes of the grandfather clock. It wasn't until she heard the grandfather clock chiming that she woke up and remembered that she had to stop it before it struck 13. She stumbled out of bed. As soon as she felt the floorboards beneath her feet, she knew she was back in the dollhouse. She didn't know how many times the clock had chimed already, so she ran down the stairs to the hallway as quickly as she could. She opened the tall front door of the clock and peered inside. Behind the pendulum, she could see the weight that controlled the gears. She waited for the pendulum to swing by, then thrust her head inside and pulled the weight as hard as she could. The chain played out as she dragged the weight down, and there was an alarming grinding sound from inside the clock. The pendulum stopped. Mara looked at the clock face. The hands had ceased moving. But had she actually accomplished anything, or had she just broken the clock? She recalled the twins' warning about how she might be trapped there forever if she had. Why am I still here? Asked a voice from behind her. Mara turned around. Charlotte was there, staring at her with her painted-on eyes. She still looked like a doll, but she was obviously alive. She was wearing the red dress. You're the girl, Charlotte said. The one who chose me. The one my mother said would come. Her painted lips didn't move, and her voice seemed to come from far away. Yes, Mara said. I found you in a shop. Charlotte took a step toward her, and Mara stepped back, afraid. Why are you frightened? Charlotte asked. Because you want to trade places with me, said Mara, and I don't want to live in this house. Why not? Charlotte asked. It's a lovely house. Thank you, said Mara. My mother and I made it together. Mother, Charlotte said, as if she were tasting the word. I miss my mother. I know, Mara said. I want to talk to you about that. Your mother needs you to go to her in the hereafter. Hereafter, said Charlotte. She sounded sad. No, I want to be here, in the real world, in a real house, with my real mother. That's the thing, Mara said. If you stay here, then I have to stay here in this house, and I can't be with my mother, or my father, or brother, and that would make me very sad. Charlotte didn't say anything. Mara wasn't sure what else to say to make her understand. Suddenly, she felt very tired. She found herself sitting down on the floor and leaning back against the wall. She put her hand to her forehead. She was burning up. "Are you ill?" Charlotte's voice was a mix of curiosity and concern. "I have a fever," Mara said. "That's all. I need to lie down." "Fever," Charlotte said. She sounded afraid now. Then Mara remembered. Charlotte had died from scarlet fever. The doll walked stiffly over to where Mara was slumped against the wall. She bent over and placed a hand on Mara's cheek. The porcelain was cool against Mara's skin. "I need to lie down," Mara whispered, her voice hoarse. She coughed. "I need my mother. She can help me." She was feeling really sick now. The fever seemed to be coursing through her. She grew dizzy. The next thing she knew, she was being picked up. She could feel the hard porcelain of Charlotte's limbs holding her up. The doll was carrying her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. Charlotte replied with one word. Her voice filled Mara's head like the sound of rain. "Mother." Mara soon wakes up, and she's feeling a lot better, but she looks around and she's still in the dollhouse. And in fact, there's someone sitting beside the bed. She doesn't recognize her at first, but she quickly realizes that this is Violetta Grundy, Charlotte's mother. And in fact, she can see behind her Charlotte, but she's not a doll anymore. Now she looks like a little girl. They say that she's glad that she's feeling better, but when Mara asks what they are and if she can go home, they say, no, we want you to stay with us. And in fact, Charlotte seems excited to have a sister to play with. And this is when Mara realizes that these are ghosts, and they're trying to take her to the hereafter with them. And so she starts to panic, but she doesn't want to react, because when she tries to say, "You need to let me go," Violetta basically pushes her into the bed forcefully and says, "No, you're not going anywhere." And so she has to play nice. She has to say, "You know what, I think you're right. Yeah, I wouldn't mind having a sister. And you know what, I'm feeling better, but I think I need to use the bathroom." And so they let her get out of bed, and she walks to the doorway. But as soon as she gets to the door and sees that they're not looking at her, she races down the stairs as fast as she can. She's in the attic, so she has to race down 2 flights of stairs, running, and she hears them calling after her, saying, "Where do you think you're going?" All this stuff. But she manages to get to the grandfather clock, and desperate, she just grabs the thing, starts shaking it, and trying to pull it over. And as soon as Charlotte sees what she's doing, she cries out no, but she pulls over the grandfather clock and it smashes on the floor. At first she's worried that the twin witch sisters were right, that maybe she's trapped herself there forever, but she hears a quiet voice whisper, "Goodbye, sister." And then, once again, Mara is standing in her bedroom. She peeks inside of the dollhouse and she sees that the grandfather clock has been broken into pieces, but there's no sign of Charlotte the doll or her mother. In fact, Mara's mother comes in to check on her because she thought she heard her yelling, but she says that she's alright, and she ends up going to sleep, and she sleeps peacefully for the first time in 2 nights. Then I like it, there's a little bit of a close off for this story, because the next day she's so glad, she's hugging her brother and she's giving her dad a kiss, and they're a little bit confused why she's acting like this, but she says, "Hey, I'm just happy to see my family." So she goes to school, and as she gets to class, the teacher says, "Oh, and class, before we get started, there's a new student I'd like to introduce to you today." Then the classroom door opens, and a girl with pale skin, dark hair, and big brown eyes steps in. The teacher introduces her as Charlotte, and the girl says that she's glad to meet them all, and she's hoping they're all going to be very good friends. The end. Okay, so let's start pulling this one apart, shall we? So I want to start with the things that I really like, because I really do like the odds and ends character. I've always liked this idea of the needful things, the creepy store that offers the creepy things, each one of them the potential MacGuffin for a plot around which will be built. So I do like that concept, it's a lot of fun. And the characters, for the most part, feel real. I do think they're a little bit cutesy saccharine, but admittedly, some of that comes from my moral sensibilities of thinking that most kids are very, disaffected and ironic. But I'm pretty sure this is a 10-year-old girl, and her brother's 7 years. I mean, yeah, they do say she's in 5th grade, so my math says she should be about 10. So, yeah, okay, maybe it makes more sense that she wouldn't be as cynical as some of the teenagers and 12-year-olds in some of the other books. But if I'm perfectly honest, some of these annoyances of mine were eased a lot when she actually argued and accused her brother of cutting her hair. Like, that felt real. That felt like something that a sister would do to a younger brother. And the way he argued back as a 7-year-old, like, "I wouldn't touch your hair if you paid me." Like, you know what, I like that. That felt real to me. And I like some of the softening of some of the plot points. Like I said, I like the fact that our girl wants to know how to stop a clock, and so she talks to her mum, and her excuse is, it's talking about a book that I read. And we already know that's a book she read, and that makes sense. And that's actually a real book, and if you know about that book, the stuff she talks about things happening at 13 clock at midnight. That actually happens in the book, so that makes perfect sense. Or our girl needs to go to bed, and so she leaves the store early, and then she fakes having a cold, and they give her a drowsy cough medicine. That makes sense. Or again, at the very beginning of the book, how she decides to go to a store that's called Frightville because she sees someone who bought dolls from that store who told her that they have lots of different interesting dolls and things in the store. That also makes sense. Like, on the face of it, it would grate against me because I'm like, oh, you could just add in something to make it make sense. This book does that fantastically. This is the kind of thing I talk about when I say that the plot didn't quite make sense, but just a little bit of tweaking could have fixed it. This book has those tweaks. Oh, and the thing I like the most is that the sisters tell her, don't break the clock. She thinks, all right, I don't want to break the clock. And then the solution to the story is that she broke the clock, which would have annoyed me, except that the book used that for the twist that by breaking the clock, she didn't escape from the doll. What she did was she released it into the real world with that little cliffhanger ending. Like, a lot of these twists are just thrown in there to be like, oh, wow, and sort of make the kids shocked because, kids aren't used to the fact that it's really, really easy to contrive a twist. But this one actually had a reason for the twist, and I liked it. It made the pieces fit together. But as to the things I don't like so much, I think I've mentioned this before, but I don't like ghost stories because it perpetuates this belief in dualism and spiritualism, and I find that whole thing really frustrating. Oh, hold up, no. This a personal note of mine. Side note: I've decided I say the word frustrating too much, so I'm going to try to avoid it. So I find it aggravating that people perpetuate this belief in ghosts and spirits and nonsense like that. And so the fact that this is ultimately a ghost story, I don't like that aspect of it. It sort of gets away with a little bit by being a cursed doll, but then even that I don't like because I don't like the way the magic works. Because, yes, I know it's like, oh, there's ghosts, so it's magic. Who cares how the magic works? You know who cares how the magic works? I care how the magic works. And a lot of kids would care about... actually, I say that. I, as a kid, cared how the magic works. And a lot of the readers would care because it does bother me that it doesn't actually make sense, right? So the doll comes to life if you don't say a rhyme at night, but it only lasts for like an hour, so I don't quite understand. So it ends after an hour, apparently. But what exactly is she do? Like, is she actually in the real world? How come nobody else saw her in the real world when she was big? And then, apparently the way she trapped Mara in the house was by making a tiny doll, but she didn't inhabit the tiny doll. The tiny doll just drew her into the house with her head. Like, why would that make sense? Like, that would imply that the way that you get the doll trapped in the house would be to build a doll of the doll. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then what with the grandfather clock thing? Like, she says herself, they built it out of a kit that they bought from a miniature thing store. So are you telling me that if they built this dollhouse and they hadn't put a little miniature grandfather clock inside, that the magic wouldn't have worked? Because the mechanism of this magic apparently works because of the mechanisms of a grandfather clock, which doesn't have a mechanism because it's a miniature. And then the fact that the dollhouse is real, and it builds a wall in the front of it, but it's also not real because everything inside is plastic and wood, but it has real door handles and doorknobs and the bed feels real. Like, why are some things real and some things not real? That doesn't make any sense. And it breaks my brain to try to figure out why it does this, because the only reason it does this isn't based on logic, it's based on narrative convenience. Isn't it convenient that this house is locked off? Even though you could have fixed that so easily. Do you know you can buy doll houses which have a hinge on the front, so you can close and open the front? To me, that's creepier. Imagine she'd wake up and she'd see that there's just a sheer drop off the end, and the doll says, you're stuck in the house, gives her a poke, forces her to fall over, and then locks the house shut. Imagine an entire wall slamming in your face. That's horrifying. Why would you not do that, Okay, some of that's getting into, the way I write it territory. I don't really think this needs a sort of a rewrite thing. I don't like a lot of the concepts, but some of that is definitely my bias against ghosts, but I definitely think the magic thing needs a bit more work. And the last thing, and I have to mention this because it is a thing that bothers me a lot, is the title. The title of this book is Don't Let the Doll In. After hearing this summary, can you explain to me at which point she let the doll in a bad way? Like, shouldn't the title be Don't Forget the Doll Rhyme that keeps it asleep? Obviously, you're not going to call it that, but that's what I'm saying. Where does the title come from? If anything, it should be Don't Let the Doll Out, because letting the doll get out of the dollhouse is the problem, right? That's... It's about dolls, but you should try to put a title in there that gives you some sense of what the story's about. And honestly, this title, the only thing it tells you is that there's a doll in the story. It doesn't tell you anything about what to expect in this. So that does bother me a little bit. That's not enough to ruin the score. It's just, it's bad to have a lie on the front cover of your book, right? So taking all that into account, I have decided to weight my own biases against ghosts and that kind of a thing less than usual, because personally, the way I feel about this book is that it's a C, but I've realized that a lot of that comes from the fact that I don't like ghosts, I don't like the way that they've done the magic, I don't like the stuff, but this is really well written. I do enjoy the characters, even though, again, they got things that I don't like, how they're not cynical enough, but that's another personal thing. So ultimately, this book, to me, is actually a B-. It does have some good character stuff. The plot does work. It does have tension building. I really love in that first scene how you get some dramatic tension in there. The reader can tell that the white thing was obviously the nightdress of the thing that the doll was wearing, but our girl is just like, oh, it must have been a dream. Who cares? When we know it's more than that. Like building the tension up that way, slow and steady. This does that really well. So yeah, B-, very well done. But what can we learn from this book? Well, to me, the first lesson is obvious. I've already talked about how I found the magic in this book so illogical. I found the magic illogical, and that's actually what I want to talk about. So obviously, magic, by definition, is illogical and unrealistic, because if magic followed the exact principles that exist in the real world, it wouldn't be magic. It would just be physics, nature. But magic is meant to be supernature, supernatural. But the way to make that work in a story, and so that it doesn't just make everything start falling apart, is instead of following the rules of physics, instead have them follow the rules of logic. And when I say that, I mean the fundamental axiomatic rules of logic. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. Things like A cannot equal not A. In fact, in TV tropes, they call this trope magic A equals magic A, because that is the basic idea. Instead of magic having the ability to do anything, have godlike abilities, instead it says, okay, this thing is magic, it does something incredible, but it just does that. And so once you know that, you can now use that way. And so that means that your main characters can use that to solve the puzzle of the story. See, this story I found so... I need to stop saying frustrating. I did not like the fact that the same thing that put the doll in the doll's body and made her tiny was the fact that she built a memorial doll, but the way to get the main girl in there not as a doll was to build a tiny doll that she then did not inhabit, even though it used the same principles to build that doll. So that was magic A equals magic B, because that's a different mechanism. And then the magic started because of a rhyme, but it ends because of a magic clock. I'll talk about this briefly, but the difference between science fiction and fantasy, and when talking about magic, that is basically a kind of fantasy, is that fantasy deals with rules and science fiction deals with tools. And so when dealing with fantasy, whether it's in the form of prophecy or magic spells or evil monsters, you need to understand the rules, and that way you can play the game fairly. Whereas when it comes to science fiction, there are these tools which have their abilities that you need to be able to fundamentally use to affect the world. And so yes, even though this is a horror story and not fantasy, this is a sort of a dark fantasy concept playing with accursed objects and the magic of ghosts. Now, if that sounds like too much work, then I at least say, even if it doesn't follow some strict idea, you should have some basic concept behind it. Like, for instance, if it's not fundamental axiomatic logic, you could use emotional logic. Like, for instance, in this story, what I think would make more sense, in this story they imply that it happens because the clock's spinning backwards and it's magic. I don't think that makes sense, but what makes sense to me is if the clock instead stopped perfectly still. That makes emotional sense to me, because the whole idea of creating this morning shrine, a doll with your child's hair to keep alive, you're trying to stop time. You're trying to say, no, I don't want to accept that time moved on and my child died. I want it to stay still in that moment when she was alive. That makes emotional sense to me. And so then the ending where she breaks the clock makes perfect sense, right? Because then she's breaking this concept of stopping time still. She wants to move forward. She wants to live her life, right? That makes perfect sense. And it even makes sense with the twist, because now the girl's living her life. So you know what I'm saying? It doesn't need to make sense physically, but it needs to make sense to the reader so that they can follow on with the story. Because if your magic can just do anything without limits, well, then there's no reason why your story didn't end on the first page. But the second lesson is something that I really enjoyed in this book, even though in retrospect it was kind of stupid. But I think that's kind of the point, is don't be too utilitarian with your story. Right? Because then people are going to be able to pick your story apart. It's the issue of, if you're watching a murder mystery and there's a character who doesn't have any role in the story, but they seem to have a lot of scenes, then you know they're the killer. Because fundamentally, from a utilitarian point of view, you need to have the character who is the killer on screen enough to understand their character. If they have no other purpose, then you can pretty easily find out who the character was. And I was thinking about that because in this story, the Porridge twins serve no necessary purpose. I know that the store Frightville is a new store, so it kind of makes sense that maybe Odds and Ends would be out and he would have to go get more stock for the store. But you didn't need to throw in two sisters who are clearly witches, who are using it for their own needs. But they were so much fun, they had so much character, and I like the fact that they definitely understood magic well enough to be concerned and try not to scare the little girl, even though they think she's possibly going to get trapped in a dollhouse for the rest of her existence, not just life. She's going to be a doll. So you see what I mean? Like, that didn't need to be there. But them being there was so much fun. Like, it added more to the story. It made the world feel bigger to me. It made Odson seem more like an interesting character because he has friends, and of course his friends will be just as quirky as him. And that was a lot of fun. And of course, the most important thing is that they served a purpose. They were filling in for Odson while he was away, so they gave a little bit of that exposition. If they were just there to be quirky, well, then that's just annoying. Let's get back to the story, please. But even when someone isn't a main character, I mean, if you just have some incidental character who doesn't really move the plot forward, why not make them three-dimensional, make them fun? And not only does that mean that I engage with the story more, but it can make it easier to hide the cogs of your story. Like I said, some stories have characters that need to serve one purpose. Like you say, okay, the only reason we have this librarian character who's so characteristic is probably because they're going to use them for exposition later about some book that the kids aren't going to read. Instead, hide that. Have all your characters feel real and add a little bit more fun in there so that when that comes up, it's not going to be something that people were expecting. It's going to be, oh wow, they were an interesting character to begin with. I'm glad we get to see a little bit more of them. You know what I mean? So don't think that a story is just putting the pieces together until you've got your whole puzzle and then stopping. Flesh it out. Go a little further. Have a bit of fun. Like, it's a side note thing, but I mentioned how they watched a movie that was called Laser Unicorn Force. This book has, and admittedly it's too long, a little paragraph explaining that show is about unicorns that are astronauts in space, and they defeat the toxic bots that spread pollution around the alien planet. Like, that's really stupid, and I've always enjoyed the stupid throwaway, non-trademark infringing shows and stuff for kids. I find that kind of funny, but it was fun. It got me thinking, oh, I understand why the kids would enjoy this. This sounds kind of fun. There's no need to go into that much detail for a show that doesn't exist, but it made the story a little bit more fun for me. So don't think that you need to be utilitarian all the time. Only fix things that make the story move forward. Obviously murder your darlings if it's too long, but don't be afraid to play around in your toy box. Because if it was fun to write, it's probably going to be fun to read. So, that was Frightville number 1, Don't Let the Doll In. A pretty good start. I mean, honestly, now that I'm actually started, John Ward is definitely off my Christmas card list, but I'm glad that Mike Ford stepped up to give me a relatively enjoyable series so that we can get closer to the end of this season. And since we've been talking about magic so much, I look forward to the next book where we actually have something that has powerful magic that can grant wishes, but it does it in a way that I think is actually quite interesting. But we'll have to talk about that in the next episode. So until then, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.